Hello, I'm Greg Daffner, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you today from here in Hong Kong on behalf of the Global Satellite Coalition. For those of you that don't know what GSC is, it was formed as a united voice for the satellite industry ahead of WRC-19 and represents the continuing joint cooperation of 7 different satellite associations from around the globe. Here in Asia, GSC is co-sponsoring this conference with one of the 7 member associations, APSCC, which is the Asia Pacific Satellite Communications Council, of which I am currently serving as president. In addition, I'm also CEO of GAPSAT, which is a member of both GSC and APSCC. Next slide, please. Connecting Asia is not easy. It's a complex landscape in terms of size, geography, climate, diversity, not to mention politics and culture. Satellite enables connectivity within days and weeks, just by putting up an antenna and pointing it to a communication satellite. It does not take years like major terrestrial infrastructure projects. Moreover, satellite connects users directly to media and broadband. It enables community Wi-Fi, and it can provide backhaul to and from cellular base stations, which are all uses highly needed here in Asia. Today, it is my pleasure, next slide, to introduce Richard Wormsley, Director of Satellite Services for LS Telecom, to answer the question, is spectrum the answer? Richard has over 25 years experience working in the fields of radio spectrum management, public telecommunications, digital broadcasting, and satellite communications. He has worked for regulators, network operators, financiers, manufacturers, and end users on a wide range of issues covering spectrum pricing, demand, licensing, cost modeling, and various technical investigations. I have long been an admirer of Richard's work myself, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce him to you today. Take it away, Richard.
Thank you very much, Greg, for the kind introduction and the kind words. And thank you also to GSC and all the associated organizations for inviting me to speak here today. I should say that LS Telecom is not connected with GSC. But I know, as Greg said, that much of the work we've done has been appreciated, not just by the satellite community, I should add, but also by broadcasters, those in the defense community, and many others around the world. And so the question I've been asked today is spectrum the answer? Which in itself begs the question, the answer to what? So what I'm planning to do is just talk a little bit about what spectrum does bring and what it doesn't bring, so that we can maybe understand where it fits within the whole ecosystem, the whole business system of those that use spectrum for their connectivity. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. When you are providing any kind of broadband service, there are 3 things you have to balance, and those 3 things are cost and capacity and coverage. And it's a kind of 3-body problem. If you change one of them, the others can change in ways you may not necessarily understand. However, you cannot change capacity without changing cost or coverage, or you can't change coverage without changing cost capacity. I think you get the idea. Now, the question I want to try and address in Is Spectrum the Answer is, how does spectrum affect this balance between the cost, the capacity, and the coverage? And what can we learn from that? So if I could have the next slide, please. So the first question is, does spectrum improve coverage? And actually, there's one thing that we can agree on, which is that if you look at frequencies below 1 gigahertz, they provide better coverage than, for example, millimeter wave. The higher you go in frequency, the lower the coverage. And that's just a fact of life. It's a physical fact. There is an equation, mathematical, the free space loss equation, and it's dependent on frequency. So that's not just a made up thing. It's an actual physical, and by physical, I mean physics fact. Higher you go in frequency, the less coverage that you will provide. So in that respect, we could say that certain spectrum improves coverage. However, if we take the 700 megahertz band, which is one of the lower frequencies which we have available for broadband, for mobile broadband anyway, it provides good coverage. It has the best characteristics because it's the lowest frequency, but we can't do anything to provide coverage unless we use that spectrum. And to do so, we need to put in infrastructure. We need to build cell sites. We can put it on existing cell sites, but it's not going to increase coverage very significantly. The only real way to improve coverage is to roll out that spectrum onto sites in areas that aren't covered. So do we need low frequencies to do that? Maybe, or maybe not. It depends on the sites, but the fundamental fact is we have to have more infrastructure in order to use more spectrum. And even if we add spectrum in an existing band, so one thing that's happened over the COVID period is that a number of regulators have loaned spectrum to the mobile operators. They have provided them with a temporary addition to the spectrum they already had. Now that's fallen into two categories. It's fallen into spectrum which is in a band that that mobile operator didn't have before, and it's also fallen into a band they did have. If it's into a band they didn't have before, we're back to square one. We can't use that without rolling out infrastructure. And are we going to do that if it's a loan of temporary spectrum? I doubt it. If it's in a band which already we have access to, and if our technology, if our base stations are capable of using that spectrum, then we can add that onto our base stations. But actually, it doesn't improve coverage. So does spectrum improve coverage if you put in the infrastructure? You could argue yes, that it does. Next slide, please. So does spectrum improve capacity? Well, let's go back to the physics. There is an equation for capacity, Shannon's equation, and one of the inputs to that equation is bandwidth. And in bandwidth, we talk about, certainly for radio systems, the amount of spectrum. So if you use more spectrum, you can achieve greater capacity. But that's only the case if you actually use the spectrum. And the diagram on the right there, which may be a little difficult to see, but the slides will be available afterwards. It's also available on the LS Telecom website as a report, looks at the amount of spectrum which has been licensed for mobile operators to use and compares that with three things. There's a yellow line. That is the total amount of what I've called harmonized spectrum. So if we take in Asia Pacific, 700, 850 and 900, 1800, 2100, 23, 26, and so on, and you add all those together in the way that they're configured, the total amount is just over 900 megahertz that is available in harmonized bands, built into handsets, there's infrastructure available, and so on. The orange bar is prior to WRC19, so we're not talking about the new millimeter wave spectrum, is the amount that was identified at that time for IMT, and IMT is the ITU's terminology for mobile services. And depending in which country you're in the region, the amount that's available varies. So it depends, for example, if you have footnotes to use the satellite C-band, or a footnote to use 2.3, or whatever it might be. There is a range, and you can see that's higher than the bands harmonized. Why would that be? Why would the ITU identify spectrum, but then it's not part of a harmonized band? And the answer to that is that there are big blocks of spectrum identified for IMT that have to be then broken up into bands that we can use in handsets. There are gaps between that. There are bands that are available but aren't yet harmonized. So there is a range of bands which we could use for IMT because the ITU says we can, but they're not currently built into infrastructure, built into handsets. And the red bar at the very top there is based on an ITU-R report. You can possibly see the number there, M2078, which was an attempt to forecast how much spectrum would be needed by 2020 for mobile services. So that's the yellow, the orange, and the red. What about the bars across the bottom? Well, in 2014, we did a study to investigate how much spectrum had been licensed in various countries across the world, not just in this region. And we redid that in 2019 to see what progress had been made. So the blue bars represent the situation as it was in 2014, and the red bars as it was in 2019. And you can see a number of countries have made significant progress. I should point out, by the way, that if there's a country that's only in red, doesn't mean it had no mobile spectrum in 2014. It just means that no data was available at that time. So that includes Nepal, Myanmar, and Taiwan. And you can see that some countries towards the right-hand end, China, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand, have pretty much licensed all of the spectrum in harmonized bands. They're very close to that yellow line. But we don't have to go far below that until we find countries that are, at best, have licensed about 50% of that spectrum. And that means there's several hundred megahertz that are yet to be licensed. It's available, it's recognized, it's harmonized, it's in the handsets, it's in the infrastructure, it just hasn't been licensed. So that spectrum could improve capacity very, very significantly without needing to turn to millimeter wave or any of the other bands. So that's one issue. The second issue is the forecast. And this actually, if you were watching the session this morning, came up a number of times, that there have been many forecasts of demand for spectrum. And in general, they have overestimated that which is necessary. And if you were reading the comments along in the chat this morning, people were pointing out that these forecasts, although they take account to some extent of an understanding of the mobile technology itself, and for example, spectrum efficiency improvements, they don't take account of other things such as improvements in compression technologies for video, or the ability to intelligently route traffic, any of those things. So we just assume there is this growth in traffic and we need more spectrum, but actually that growth is predicated on a number of applications, including video, which themselves have changes. So back to the question, does spectrum improve capacity? Well, only if you use it. So we need to make sure we're using that which is already available. Now, the mobile operators that were given spectrum in existing bands during the pandemic were able to increase the capacity of their networks, and we've heard that already within the conference. New spectrum does give more capacity, but if it's not in a band that you already have access to through your existing infrastructure, you still have to build new sites. You have to implement that spectrum band on that site and on those sites, and therefore it costs you. There's nothing free here. And remember, my initial premise was there's a balance between cost, capacity, and coverage. And what we're seeing is actually, even with spectrum, it gives you more capacity, but only at more cost. So does it improve capacity? Maybe. Okay, next slide, please. So let's come and try and stitch all this together. Is spectrum the answer to the question? Where the question, I think, is about cost, capacity, and coverage. So is spectrum the answer? Well, yes, because without spectrum, there is no wireless service of any kind at all. So if the question is, do we need spectrum to provide a wireless service? The answer is clearly yes, it is. If the question is about, can we enhance coverage and capacity with new spectrum? The answer is no. Actually, we enhance coverage and capacity with more infrastructure. And yes, there is an extent to which spectrum can improve capacity, but we still largely require additional cost. Can spectrum actually, is spectrum the answer if we have new bands, if we provide people with new frequencies? Well, yes, we can use it to enhance capacity, but we would still need new infrastructure and therefore new cost. We can improve capacity, but only if we are using spectrum in existing bands. If we loan or give or sell or get new spectrum in a band that we don't have the facility to use, then that does absolutely nothing to improve capacity or coverage. So I think my answer to the question, is spectrum the answer, is that spectrum is part of the answer. Infrastructure is important, and that infrastructure in itself may use other spectrum. I mean, if we're talking about trying to cover remote or rural areas, we have to get the connectivity to those areas. And unless we're intending to dig up the route in between and lay fiber, that connection will be wireless, and that will use spectrum as well. It could be fixed links. It could well be satellite spectrum. And so I think overall, spectrum is part of the answer. And it's not just, and this is the bit we should remember, it's not just for mobile operators, because we always seem to think about spectrum being a key input to mobile operators and their business cases. But it's not just for mobile operators, it's for all wireless technology solutions. We were looking this morning in the session about the UHF band and the need for broadcasting. Broadcasting requires spectrum too. And again, the question for me is about forecasting and getting that right and understanding what's needed in the future. Satellites clearly also need spectrum. They are a wireless technology. There are many others, radars, GNSS, the GPS systems that we use to find out where we are. There are so many things that use spectrum, and the difficulty, I think, for spectrum regulators now is balancing this. Technically, we can work out what fits where and what works best where, but then there's a policy decision to be taken. Do we use this spectrum for one technology, or do we use it for a different one? So is spectrum the answer? It's part of the answer. Greg, I don't know if you want to rejoin me.
If they'll let me. Thank you. That was terrific, Richard. Thank you very much. And we'll be back to Richard in a moment, but just to kind of close this thing off with another point here. Next slide, please. That was Richard's last slide. That must be where you have your office that you're not at right now.
It was actually a picture of our offices in Germany, yes, our headquarters.
And before I do my conclusion, there's one question that was raised, and I didn't want to lose the moment, because you started there and you kind of brought it back in at the end, where you talked about specifically, Richard, the spectrum which many administrations, regulators had loaned to mobile operators to help them facilitate communication during the COVID crisis. And the question that we have from Christopher Slaughter, who is a special advisor to APSCC, so thank you, Christopher, is whether or not that loan spectrum is likely to ever be reclaimed by the regulators, or is it a question of possession being 9/10 of the law?
Well, we've already started to see some countries reclaim or end the loan of that spectrum. So some of it is already going back to the pot and will eventually be released through auction or whatever mechanism the regulator concerned chooses. So actually, I think it is actually a loan, and it will go back. The issue then is, if that spectrum is available and has been made almost instantly available to the mobile operators for them to use, we take it back because it was a loan, but then we have to put in place a process to reassign that to an operator, which, if we're talking about an auction, may be another year. In my mind, there's two answers to this. One is loan it until you find a process that allows you to then auction it, which might mean that the person using it has to change, or take it back, or keep it. And that was one other suggestion that's been made so far, is actually maybe that spectrum needs to be kept aside so that if something like this happens in the future, it's there again to be used again.
That's a really clever idea. Thank you. And then just to continue and to finish up on the slides, fiber to the premises is prohibitively expensive for most of the geography in Asia and much of the world. Small cell fixed wireless access, FWA, is not much cheaper as a practical matter. Terrestrial mobile services are terrific. We all depend on them. Even the most enthusiastic advocates for satellite communications are major users across the board, and without exception, in my experience, of terrestrial mobile services. But I think that Richard's points really lead to the conclusion that terrestrial mobile will never be the complete answer, even in the most distant future, and that countries and people will always need satellites because they do a number of things that either complement, facilitate, or supplement what terrestrial mobile services can provide. Satellites offer the most cost-effective thin route, rural, remote, very wide area coverage. In fact, if you think about it, a single satellite beam can cover almost half of the Earth from one location. And that makes it especially efficient for multicast and broadcast services, and for the provision of remote and non-terrestrial mobile services. And by that I mean aeronautical services, maritime services, and land mobile services to areas where there's no terrestrial infrastructure and your phones won't work. And in addition, there is something, and this I think goes to the point maybe more broadly in terms of saving spectrum, which is the flip side of that, that there are times where terrestrial infrastructure is incapacitated in catastrophic kinds of weather conditions, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc., where satellite is what offers restoration and emergency communications. So the role of satellite, I think, is going to continue indefinitely and makes a lot of sense, and we will and we do depend on it. So now let's move into the broader questions that jump out of Richard's presentation. You had a chart. I don't know if we want to go back, but you had a chart. Actually, can you guys go back to the chart which had the red and blue lines, the chart after that one? Yeah, that one. This is sort of a snapshot, I guess, because of the dates, the 2014, 2019, Richard, that was spectrum that had been assigned in each of these countries prior to the WRC 19 conference. And if that's true, in addition to the spectrum that you've got visualized on this chart, how much additional spectrum was allocated to IMT, roughly, at WRC 19?
It's another 30,000 megahertz.
30,000 megahertz.
Yeah.
Versus the 2,000 that you have on display here.
Yeah, so I mean, if you were to draw this is an interesting question, because if you were to draw the new line on here, I mean, it depends on the size of the screen that you have. But I mean, typically, looking at how big this is coming out on my screen, you're talking about a new orange bar, which is probably, I don't know, 9 feet, 3 meters above the top of the screen. I mean, it's just way off the top there. And of course, as of today, those bars haven't really grown. I mean, okay, there are now some countries that have actually assigned hundreds of megahertz of millimeter wave, but in most cases, that's not the point. So if we were now trying to compare the amount that's been licensed with the amount that's been identified, the gap is going to be phenomenal. Incidentally, I got that figure wrong. It's about 17 gigahertz of new spectrum, but that's still 17,000 megahertz. And so I would be very interested if we come back to this before the next WRC and say, okay, we've moved the yellow bar, we've moved the orange bar. Obviously, the red bar will be different because we'll be talking about 2023. But where does that now leave us? How much of that available spectrum has actually been licensed to operators? And my suspicion is, in many countries, these bars, if we tried to rescale them, would be insignificant. You wouldn't even see them. 250 or 300 megahertz in Nepal compared to 18,000 that's available, it's not going to show up. And it begs the question, if we're not using it now, why are we still looking for more?
Why?
I mean, there are agenda items at the next WRC to look for more IMT spectrum. Really, the point of this slide was already use what you have first before you ask for more. Now we have 20 times more available. We need to use that before we start looking for still more. And I think there's a separate question on this, because it's not just using it, but I think there's still a question mark over whether it's commercially sensible and viable to run certainly mobile services in millimeter wave. And until we've proven that business case, it's not just a question of assigning it and using it. It's a question of actually needing it. If it doesn't work, if we can't do what we want to do with it, then do we really need more of the same, or should we be looking to do something different?
It's interesting because one of the issues that we're not going to get into today, but one of the issues that has been at the periphery of satellite systems and the filing for satellite slots and constellations has been the question of how much it's being used and how much of it's being warehoused for potential future use and so forth. But however egregious some of the issues that have arisen in that context, it pales before the example here. I mean, in the most heavily trafficked spectrum countries that you have on your chart, it's the most that they've actually got is 50% of the allocated spectrum has already been licensed. So without any kind of ITU process, there's the possibility to minimum double, and in some countries triple, quadruple. And you're describing a phenomenon where we have 17,000 additional megahertz on top of that, and maybe literally on top of it. So is this just some kind of insatiable thirst, or is there an actual logic behind this? Or is there some way of saving money? Or is this so that manufacturers of equipment can sell more kit in some fashion?
Well, you ask a very interesting question, and I'd want to take a step back from that. I mean, if you look at, for example, even looking at the chart we have in front of us, the forecast that was put together as an ITU report, if you went to the working meetings of the people developing that, obviously the ITU is a country-based organization, so it would be representatives from different countries. But the kind of countries that were involved in putting that together were people like Japan, China, South Korea, Finland, Sweden. And I may or may not be mistaken, but all of those countries have major mobile manufacturing companies in them. So who is requesting all the spectrum? If you follow the money, so to speak, it goes back to most of those mobile manufacturers who obviously every single new band, they can sell new equipment, they can sell new infrastructure. If you talk to the mobile operators, they'd always be happy to have more spectrum. But do they want millimeter wave spectrum, or do they want spectrum that they can use because it's in handsets, it works with their existing infrastructure and so on? So where does that come from? It does largely come from manufacturers rather than operators themselves. I mean, if you were to present this to a regulator, or if you present this chart to a mobile operator rather in a country such as, let's pick one, Thailand or India, and say, look, there's only half the spectrum, they would say, of course. Well, people complain about the service, the speed isn't quick enough. If we had double the spectrum, we'd be much better. Well, there is double the spectrum without doing anything, without really expending a lot of effort in using super millimeter waves. So yeah, let's use what we have.
Well, actually, then let's flip the question that we asked earlier, that Christopher Slaughter asked earlier. If there's 17,000 additional megahertz that has been allocated globally, effectively, do you think it'll ever be used, or will it lay fallow for an indefinite period, assuming that there's not some kind of remarkable transformational technology that no one's thinking about? And if you don't expect it to be used for a very long time, if at all, is there a possibility of some of that spectrum being reclaimed if it's just sitting fallow?
Well, we have a precedent almost. In the original, was it 2002 allocation of mobile bands for IMT, there were 2 small TDD bands which have not been used, except in China. But in every other country in the world, they've gone unused. And in Europe, which had a directive that said this piece of spectrum is for mobile, that directive has been repealed, and that piece of spectrum is now for wireless video cameras. So there is definitely a use it or lose it, not yet at the ITU level maybe, but definitely at a regional level. And so with all this new spectrum, it will be fascinating to see if it gets used. There's so many things that need to fall into place for that to happen. And unfortunately, although the ITU has harmonized this spectrum to some extent, there are still regional differences. And when we're talking about very complex technology, if we don't have that complete global harmonization, I think there's still going to be difficulties. You can't sell an iPhone in China that also happens to work in Russia, even though they're neighbors, and things like that. And I mean, that's always been a bit of an issue, but I think it could become even more so. So it will be interesting. If it doesn't get used, in answer to your final question, I think there is a precedent for it to be handed back and reused for something different.
But in fact, wouldn't the plethora of unused and likely to remain unused spectrum create an inherent problem where some countries and some regions will be opting for one set of spectrum and specific bands, and other countries and other regions will be opting for others? And by giving such a wide quantity across such a large range, doesn't it just encourage for there to be a lack of harmonization, and therefore all the parade of horribles you're talking about with the uninteroperability of our equipment, our personal equipment, in the various places that we travel to?
Yes, I mean, there was this whole issue over what the operators and the manufacturers called tuning range. So they said that, I mean, I know we have a question on the side there from Qualcomm which we should address, but actually it comes into exactly what you were talking about. So there was this notion that what we needed was a tuning range, and that countries could then pick from within that range in a flexible way and implement something. That's fine if the equipment that's available also has the same tuning range in it. So if you can buy equipment that operates across all of the different IMT bands and all of the different variants, and that's workable in any country, then potentially we could use that spectrum. But if we are selling equipment, I mean, if you look at that which is already available, for example, in the 26 and 28 gigahertz band, some of it doesn't work in both bands. It works in one or the other. And some of that is because it's tied to specific mobile operators who only have spectrum in specific bands. It's very common in the US. But also there are difficulties with providing such incredibly wide tuning ranges. So the question that's popped up here, Greg, and I guess, I'm not the moderator here, but I'll throw this one back at you, is we're talking about use it or lose it. So to what extent are satellite operators already and efficiently using the 28 gigahertz, the Ka band spectrum?
Well, actually, okay, I think there's two parts to this question, and I'm glad that it's been raised by Mr. Singh from Qualcomm, or Miss Singh. I'm sorry, I'm not sure which, but senior director anyway, Qualcomm. On the one hand, there's the question of what use, as you point out, what use has satellite put 28 gigahertz to Ka band in the past, and therefore are we in a position to complain about allocation or reallocation of some of that spectrum to IMT? And then the second question is, if there is a equivalent quality spectrum adjacent to that, which would not interfere with satellite utilization and would satisfy the requirements of the IMT community, and it has the same propagation characteristics, why are we struggling doing this zero-sum game fight over the same spectrum? We could have reasonable share, each of us, that's separate and will not cause interference. Well, with regard to the first question, I think the reality is that it took many years for 28 gigahertz for the Ka band to be implemented in the satellite universe, and we've seen in the last 5 or so years its extensive growth, and it's now really on a literal roll in the sense that more satellite systems are utilizing it. The equipment on the ground that can communicate with satellites operating in this band are now widely available at affordable prices, which was a big stumbling block because you've got to get a certain degree of economies of scale and scope in order to be able to make it affordable. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, and we've overcome that. And the technology in terms of frequency reuse, which is something I wanted to talk about in the context of IMT and how that affects spectrum efficiency and capacity and costs. The frequency reuse capability of satellites operating in these higher frequencies, 28 gigahertz, have advanced remarkably in the last 3 or so years, with much lower costs satellites overall, A, and B, maybe more importantly, the per unit cost per megahertz, a kilohertz, gigahertz, however you want to slice it, has come down an order of magnitude. And so when we used to talk about how many millions of dollars per gigahertz of capacity on orbit, we're now talking about sub $1 million per gigahertz capacity, and flexible designs for satellites so that one size can fit all by having software-defined networks in the sky and so forth. So the bottom line is that that it took a long time before we started properly utilizing the 28 gigahertz, but we've been there for some years now, and this has become a point of significant growth around the world in developed and developing countries. And the satellites are getting bigger, the capacity is getting less expensive, and it's becoming much more widely used. And we've even solved, to a large degree, the problems of rain attenuation that we had in the early days in high rain density areas of the world, like Southeast Asia. But then moving back over to the question of peaceful coexistence, 26 gigahertz versus 28. Why is it that there's an obsession in the IMT community to go after 28 when 26 seems to be just as good, Richard?
Oh, right. Why did they go after 28? I think, to be honest, it's probably just down to 1 or 2 countries who wanted to go first. And in those countries, 28 was seen as being available over and above 26. I mean, we have to remember that at WRC 19, there were a plethora of different proposals about how you protect the services in and next to the 26 gigahertz band. Those same things don't necessarily occur at 28, primarily because it's a known thing. You know what's in there. So, I mean, the US, South Korea, Japan, to some extent China, thought, well, we don't want to wait for a decision on what we can use 26 and how we can use 26 gigahertz, but we know 28, we know what the situation is there, so we'll go ahead and that's what we're going to use. So I think it was just a case of jumping the gun. 28 was never on the agenda, by the way. So, I mean, it was never going to be a harmonized band that was approved by the ITU for IMT, and it still isn't. We should remember that. Yeah. It's not a band that's identified for IMT. The simple fact is, as long as it has a mobile identification, you can use it, because that's the simple fact that you're using it for a mobile service. If you're using it for fixed wireless, it has to have a fixed allocation in it. But I think it was just a case of jumping the gun, what happened to be available at the time. And you know, we've seen in the past the notion of parking bands, where services have launched in pieces of spectrum that happened to be available at the time. And the notion was that once the official band for that service became available, they would unpark themselves from the parking band, and they would go and park in the, or go and temporarily permanently set up base in the new band. And history has shown us that tends not to happen. So we take a piece of spectrum as a parking band, a temporary assignment, and then we stay there. The big example of this is DAB radio, which in across Europe and Asia is in what used to be the band 3 television band. The idea was when FM got turned off, it would all move into the FM broadcasting band. It makes a lot of sense. Of course, that's not happened. Right. So we should be concerned. I mean, if somebody's using 28 gigahertz for mobile as a temporary thing until we understand where 26 is, that's not going to help us too much, because if once it's in and operating, the chances are it'll stay there.
Okay, so we only have a couple minutes left, and then we're going to be over even more so than our shift in time. So I guess as a last question for you, Richard, is a comparison, going back to your earlier presentation, comparison of the lower bands, and I'm thinking specifically like C-band, versus the new millimeter wave bands for 5G services. How do you see that playing out? We fought very hard, and we've only been partially successful in protecting C-band, and that story continues. And there's a huge amount of new spectrum that's been allocated in the millimeter wave band. But you said earlier that a lot of that won't be used, and it's not appropriate for certain kinds of services. So just briefly, where do you see the lower band, C-band, and the upper band, upper millimeter bands playing out in the rollout of 5G?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? You know what the C stands for in C-band?
No.
Right. Okay. It's a historical thing. And I won't go into it in too much detail, but actually C stands for compromise. And really? It was because at the time, when it was actually being used for radars in World War II, they realized that lower frequency radars covered further, but actually were less accurate, and higher frequency radars, because there was more spectrum available, were more accurate, but had less coverage. And so if you went between the two, you would have a compromise between, strangely, coverage and accuracy. So C is compromise. And I think that's exactly where we are with using it for 5G. You know, if we had all the low frequency spectrum available, we could provide wide area coverage very easily. If we can find a way to effectively use the millimeter wave, we've solved the capacity problem. But for the time being, we have to sit somewhere in the middle as a compromise. It's not ideal for coverage because it's not low frequency spectrum. It's not as good as millimeter wave for capacity because it doesn't have the sheer amount of spectrum available. It's a compromise. And that's where people are parking themselves at the moment. So where does it compare to the others? It is literally sitting in the middle between the coverage, the good coverage spectrum, and the good capacity spectrum. So I think we can continue to call it compromise even for mobile, right?
So do you think that over time, though, as the systems are built out in the higher frequency bands, the millimeter wave bands, that the migration from the UHF, VHF, the sub 1,000, 1,500 megahertz cellular systems to the millimeter wavelength, are we going to be able to migrate out of, or will they be able to migrate out of C-band, or will they become entrenched and we'll never be able to get some of it back?
I think it's going to be entrenched. I mean, there's so much infrastructure out there already. There's so much investment being made in it, and an increasing amount. I think they're going to stick there. What will be interesting, though, is if we can get the millimeter bands to work, and if we can get the coverage at the lower bands, will there be less pressure for more spectrum at C-band? You know, because it is a compromise. And if we can find ways to use the other spectrum effectively, then maybe we don't need that middle band quite so much. Maybe it's not going to be quite the hot spot that it is at the moment.
Well, I hope this has been a hotspot in your calendar for everyone who's been listening. We are out of time, and I wanted to just say to the conference organizers and to Richard, this has been a terrific session. I'm glad I learned a lot. I hope you did. And the conference continues. I will hopefully see you guys and gals in the coming days. Thank you, Richard.
Absolute pleasure. And thank you very much for inviting me.
My pleasure. Cheers.